Welcome, everyone, to Potholes and Politics, local Maine issues from A to Z. I am your co-host, Rebecca Graham, here with my colleagues,
Rebecca Lambert
and Amanda Campbell,
otherwise known as Grambo, Lambo, and Cambo. We have had a bit of a hiatus because legislative session kicked off in full speed, so it's been harder to get to the podcast, let alone edit it. So we're going to try to do a little bit of a catch-up and a breakdown as to where we've been, what's happened at the legislature, and what everyone should be aware of. So, Lambo, I'm going to start with you. You had a couple of very interesting bills this week.
I sure did.
One of which I think has made it through at least one body or two bodies.
Yes, finally. I was worried that it wasn't going to, but the municipal franchise agreement was not really something that I was too heavily focused on because the Maine Community Media Association was really taking lead on it. But then they were having trouble because there's lots of lies that have been going around the State House about what this bill would do, that it would actually create new fees and new taxes on streaming services like Netflix and those type of things. But really what it is that it only applies to companies that have infrastructure in the public way. So it doesn't put any new fees onto Netflix and streaming services. It's just infrastructure. This bill also, another thing that it does is it creates a conflict resolution process with the PUC, and that's something that they can do within current resources. So that seems to be a win-win for everyone. There's broad support for it from broadband agencies, municipalities, the Attorney General's office, because this has been something that the opposition has brought up, that it's in conflict with federal law, but it is not. Our Attorney General's office has looked at the bill, has looked at all the amendments, and they feel confident that they would be able to defend it if it came to that. This bill also has significant consumer protections in it because it has explicit terms that prohibit cable companies from shifting the costs of their video equipment upgrades onto the cable subscribers. Establishes a stronger enforcement of franchise and state law compliance. And this PUC conflict resolution process will give some teeth to these contracts that have expired, that municipalities are having trouble getting them to renew.
What LD number is that?
This is LD 1967. So that one has gone through the House, and it was in the Senate, and then Senator Stewart held it. So it didn't get released back for enactment into the House. But that was released on Tuesday, I think, at the State of the State address.
So how did the taxes on streaming services like Netflix pop into that argument if it's about infrastructure in the public way, which, by the way, we give to these folks for free? Unlike every other state.
Yeah, well, it's because it's just been perpetuated by the companies that are opposed to this.
What are the companies? Who are the companies that are opposing this, and what's their stake in the game?
Charter Communications and Comcast are ones. The two that I remember, Comcast did a poll. We were invited to the Senate Republican caucus to discuss the merits of this bill. And it was obvious when I went in there that, they really wanted to hear from Charter Communications, not really from us. They started with her. She got most of the airtime. And their mind had already been made up. The ones who were going to vote for it voted for it. The ones who didn't.
Yeah, it's a battle to combat either misunderstandings or outright fallacies once they are out there. It takes a lot more effort. So you can, as we know, I think you've seen demonstrated quite frequently.
I made the comment that, these revenues, local municipalities can use these revenues for anything that they want. They're not earmarked for a certain purpose, and that they could use it to lower taxes. And it was commented that, taxes are never going to go down.
Yeah, that argument, it always falls flat because the reason that taxes go up are because the legislature doesn't actually fund the services that it puts on municipalities. 90%
ding, 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 we have a winner.
So when the property tax bill goes up, it is because of people buying investment properties at high market value and new additional duties. Very little of that is municipally driven.
And shout out to Senator Bennett and Senator Lawrence for making really good floor speeches to try to get this through. And it did pass the Senate, but then it was held. But now it's through, so hopefully, fingers crossed, everyone.
Hopefully to go through. So you had some joy in the form of substances of previously illicit source.
Yeah. We had a full day of cannabis conversation on Wednesday. And that was, it started out with LD 1952, an act to allow on-site cannabis consumption. And this one had a really good turnout from the public health community, but there's also the other side of the coin, people who want to have these social clubs. The argument in favor of this bill is that there's so many people coming from out of state that want to come and use cannabis here, but they have no place to safely and legally consume it.
Sorry.
So, they want to have social clubs. There was another idea of hop-on, hop-off bus tours, which actually I kind of think is a good idea, where you have a sober driver, a ventilated bus. You could bring them to non-cannabis businesses. It might generate some revenue. Yeah, it might have some merit. But anyway, they said that there's something going on now because of this problem called burn cruising, where people just drive around and smoke weed in their car because they have no place to legally and safely consume their cannabis.
Well, they could have a DD and smoke it in their car, their rental car.
Yeah, that's true.
And that driving around and smoking in your car is a new concept.
Yeah, we were doing that back in high school, so I don't think it is a new concept. It just has a tagline now.
There isn't a public event that I haven't been to where there hasn't been some massive stink of marijuana, so I'm not sure it's that much of a problem.
Yeah, I'm not, and when we were specifically asked to poll our members to see how they felt about that economic portion of it, and overwhelmingly, they have said local control is where they want to have the say, and if these businesses are allowed in their within their borders. And another thing that was said that I thought was really interesting is that they challenged that presumption that visitors don't have a place to come and smoke it, because it just seems that edibles and smokeless cannabis products, that people have other options and that they don't need to physically smoke it. The smoking laws, that was another thing that was brought up. Maine has no smoking laws in all public buildings. So how is that going to conflict with that? Cigar lounges. Did you know that Maine allows cigar lounges?
I thought they had them grandfathered, I think, to a certain extent, because it's really hard to find a cigar lounge.
Right.
There's one in D.C. that's pretty awesome.
So I think there's one that they talked about in the public hearing. It's premium tobacco, and you can sample it.
I think it has to be separate from the area of sale. There's all kinds of regulations.
A majority of people, I think they use, they visit friends, or they, rent a short-term rental or something. So this would basically, target people staying in a night in a hotel.
Well, it's just one particular use. So you can buy edibles and go back to your hotel.
Right.
So it's just one particular form of use.
There's also issues with overconsumption. Like with alcohol, your bartender knows, you're obviously drunk. You can't, there's rules and trainings in place for that. But with edibles, if someone is served 400 milligrams of an edible and they've never had cannabis before, they could potentially leave there and be very intoxicated.
Yeah, I listened to a report back, I think, from DHHS, who's the lab that does the testing for marijuana in drug-involved OUIs. And, there are two components to that. One is that the police officer has to be a drug recognition expert and go through a process and be able to record what is observed, and then that gets mirrored in the level, but there's nothing about the level necessarily. Like if you're a chronic user, then that level cannot be, is also possible to not be reflected in your actual operation. So in order to have a successful conviction, you need both. You need the observation and the level, the blood level. But the blood level alone can't determine impairment, and without that, DRE. So that's an enormous lift as well. Lots of agencies are sending their officers to Florida or other states in order to get the DRE training, because there's a long list. I think there's one that's at the academy, but there's a long list, and they can't get them trained up fast enough. So it's a huge burden for municipalities with zero revenue coming to them for that glorious task.
Yeah, that was my next point, is that I think municipalities would be hard pressed to expand on this industry when they have not had any kind of financial benefit.
Yeah.
Even though they were promised a benefit when they opted in
Right.
to the programs.
Oh, well, you have $30,000 to write your $100,000 ordinance. And you opt in.
Indeed.
So what about any other, like, I don't know, shrooms, magical?
Well, they did. That was the last on the list of their big cannabis day, so they were pretty smoked by that time, and they didn't really, pun intended, and they didn't really have much to give to this. But they did listen to some people from Oregon talk about how, I think it was Oregon, about how that program is going out there. And there's a lot of confusion in the part of the bill where it talks about personal use, because it's supposed to be used in a controlled setting as a treatment option, not as adult use.
that was my question too. Were they trying to like decriminalize it and use it, or are they setting up like therapy-based use, supervised use?
A therapy-based, in a controlled setting where, there's a facilitator, and the facilitator will administer, you don't go home with the medication and do it yourself. You have this facilitator there, and you work through whatever issues you're trying to work through during this therapy session.
Yeah, there's a lot of hospitals, I think, that are doing it. Or there's a few programs, and they're having some success with PTSD. And
with like ketamine, and there was something, ayahuasca? No, I'm sorry. That was something that was brought up at the at the public hearing. They were talking about how it's religious.
Cambo, you had some big bills in a couple of committees, tax and HHS. Was it HHS?
Yes.
For general assistance?
Yeah, for general assistance was one of our LPC's platform topics when the 131st started a year ago. And all of the GA bills were carried over to the second session, with the exception of one, which was 1664, I believe, which only requested a reimbursement to municipalities be increased from 70 to 90%. And that did pass out of committee and is on the appropriations table now. The other three bills, we had mixed emotions about. One was an MMA support of one of our bills, which was presented by Representative Meyer, LD 1732, and asked for some pretty specific upgrades to the program, including additional support for municipalities, both program-wise and financial, but also put some responsibility on the department to train their staff more efficiently, because one of the complaints that GA administrators have is that they can call the hotline for help today and get one answer, and call the hotline tomorrow with the same question and get a different answer. So there's been a lot of inequity in support from the department. So, excuse me, on Tuesday, Health and Human Services met to do a final work session after working several interim meetings through the fall and trying to sort of collaborate to get all of the pieces that they liked from the multiple bills into one that they thought could pass. And so we had been given an amendment that took out some of the things we wanted, but also added in the requirement that municipalities be educated on trauma-informed service delivery and culturally and linguistically appropriate service to their GA clients. The new amendment would allow that the department is required to provide training on both of those topics, but the then again amended version saw one version on Monday, completely different version on Tuesday, which included that information and includes the word requires municipalities to do these culturally informed, trauma-informed and culturally appropriate services with, as you guessed it, no mandate preamble. So there are some questions there. The other issue that came out with the Tuesday version of the amendment, it took out all of the requirements for the department to have additional training, and it removed all of our financial requests and transferred them to the existing bill on the appropriations table. So the increase from 70 to 90 was already there. So it was appropriate for that to come out because it's already there and being considered.
It's already on that table.
Correct. But the additional things that we asked for were a 100% reimbursement over any established maximum in the instance of an emergency. So if the maximum for housing was $500 and we had to pay $1,000 because that's what the market can bear and that's what the client needed, there was no reimbursement above that maximum.
Wow.
So we asked for that for hospital stays, for temporary housing, and for interpreters, as well as a request for a 5% reimbursement for administrative costs for essentially running this municipally based state program. All of those monetary requests were removed from LD 1732 and tacked on to 1664, which is already on the appropriations table. So it will increase its fiscal note, and I don't know what will happen. What I do know will happen is that if this goes through both chambers, that we are now required to offer services that our municipal officials do not know how to provide. Our municipal officials are not social workers and are now going to be asked to act in that capacity.
Yeah, so they're going to have to undergo like a trauma-informed training?
Correct. Which the department will provide, and there have been some talks behind the scenes with the Welfare Directors Association and the new department director, the Office of Family Independence or Family Services. I'm not sure which one it is, but they have a new director who is now oversees the program that GA is a part of. And he has spoken with the folks at the Welfare Directors, but it's sort of a right hand doesn't know the left hand exists. And obviously the welfare directors have been doing this for a long time and know what works and know what doesn't and know when they need help. And now is the time. And the sponsors and proponents are concerned that the program needs revamping. And my response to that was, we need money.
Yeah, well, it strikes me as odd too. So for ambulance services and that kind of thing, there is a translator requirement, but it's offered through Maine EMS. You can also contract with, I think, for like 911 dispatchers, they have to contract. But why can the state not provide the translator service at the state level so that a municipality that might get one or two of those types of requests has some sort of resource? Otherwise, what do you do? How do you find a translator in Metabumps?
I'm not sure. And I think it's a completely valid concern because not only are you going to have to find said interpreter, now you're going to have to pay for it.
So the requirements will go through regardless, and the money is up in the air.
1732 passed out bipartisan, unanimous,
right.
out of committee.
Right,
with those
so
changes,
if that passes,
but without the money.
All of the requirements will go into place because the fiscal note is now attached to the other bill.
Correct. So potentially you have one go and one not. So
such fun.
Yeah, it was a good time.
You got any tax updates?
Lots of most of the new tax bills are being heard next week. So I would have a better update then, but there's things like changes to the language and lien notices, which is coming from the department. It doesn't impact our tax collectors or our treasurers in any way. It just cleans up some language. A couple of different bills doing that. There's a bill coming that would potentially significantly change the working waterfront current use program. That would be interesting to hear how that goes. A tax bill also to change the language that exempts properties from property tax when they are classified as an air pollution control facility.
The Wisconsin,
which is specifically geared
bill
towards Maine Yankee, but potentially could be, could have different effects depending on what kind of facility you're talking about. So there's some new stuff. The tax committee did kill the first of 3 local option sales tax fee bills yesterday, which was not a surprise. It was sort of encouraging to hear members of the tax committee recognize that municipalities should have control over those kinds of options if they want to, and the recognition that municipalities do, in fact, need additional revenue. And that without raising property taxes, at this point in time, we really don't have any other options.
Yeah, that was an initiative.
That was
by
1893, which was Tiffany Strout.
Yeah, Representative Strout.
Yeah, from Harrington. And she is a freshman legislator, and the committee, even though they voted ought not to pass, they were really supportive of her as a legislator, congratulated her for being there for her communities and sticking to her guns, which was really good to see. Yeah. So I think she will come back and could potentially be a good municipal support for our organization.
Yeah, that's great. And she seemed really embedded into the needs of her communities. So she was already in touch with her municipal officials.
She's on the school board.
Yeah, which is like super refreshing to
Absolutely.
have people that actually speak to their municipal officials before trying to solve the problems that they don't understand.
So you had some interesting stuff on first responders and rural patrol, and of course there's always housing stuff going on.
Oh, yeah, housing. I'm trying to write a big update on housing, so we won't necessarily get into all that. But there's a lot of bills that are still at play, that are still being debated, obviously. One of them got voted out, which was LD 337. The proponents believed that the way that they wrote it meant that places with zoning that said you can't have a mobile or modular or manufactured home in that area, this would preempt that. And they had put in park models, which is kind of like a different class right now. Manufactured homes are held to a different build standard because they're approved, where they are. So for like what we think of as traditional trailers after 1976, it was like a HUD level build program. So they get a certification, which means that the municipality doesn't have to necessarily go in there and regulate. So if you're a MUBEC community, you don't need to enforce MUBEC except at the point of attachment on the land. So things like the basement, if there's one that's put in, the attachment to the sewer, the adequate sewer, that kind of stuff, and whether or not it's appropriate on there, and any outbuildings or decks that slide on. That's the scope of what municipalities need to worry about in those cases. Manufactured homes, they were trying to set them out for a modular home. So modular homes often come in 3 or 4 or 5 bits. Those are built in sections outside, inside a community. And then manufactured homes kind of is this other large category. So it could be like a double wide. It could be a modular home that's in 2 pieces. So that basically they just wanted to allow them everywhere, seeing that as a low barrier for housing, which used to be that way. However, if you're buying one of those homes, they actually don't lock in the rate until delivery. So you're signing an agreement that actually goes up. And I had talked to a couple of people that had been through that process. And then, so they'd started it. They're waiting this really long time for it to be built. And then they find out what their actual price is, and it had gone up $30,000. So if you enter into one of those programs and you think that this is your mortgage rate, and then at the end, when it's delivered, so when you're about to have your home, you find out it's gone up $30,000. What do you do? Like, you've got $30,000 more to pay. So there's some interesting issues, but naturally affordable is something that they definitely aren't if you're waiting for a new one. They are definitely lower than what the stick built is, but not by much. So that is something that is, really not regulated in most municipalities. If you have a piece of land and you want to put a trailer on it, most municipalities don't care. It's the parks that they tend to regulate. And, the reasons for that have been pretty evident. If you look at things like, I think there's a park in Topsom or Brunswick, somewhere in that area. It's water and wastewater issues, and trying to figure out who's responsible, especially if that park owner is a corporation now and you don't have anybody there helping. You've got a whole bunch of people who live there and nobody is responding to deal with their water issues. And there's a similar situation, I think, in Wiscasset as well. So it's the park thing that usually is more contentious than how the home is built or whatever.
Mm. Well, in trailer parks, the trailers are more susceptible to having their pipes freeze and stuff with the skirting and no basements, unless they have a basement in it.
Yeah. But anyways, it's another erosion of local control for the few communities that do regulate them. And what was interesting is that the bigger concern, it's a divided report, ought to pass as amended, because the language actually was poorly written. So it had zoning only applying to these entities. So it would be the way that they had amended the statute. It said that these types of housings would be allowed any place where there was a single family residence, but it held them to a standard like only zoning applied to those particular homes. So if you had a historic district or something like that, but nothing else. So no other building standards, no other setback standards, only the zoning piece of it would apply. So I, submitted language that said, this is what, if you want to allow them in every area, then that's the appropriate language. What you've done is basically strip any other requirements that apply to single family residences from applying to these. And the intent, I think, is that you want them to be allowed in every area. So what you wrote doesn't necessarily do that. And then they interestingly had stripped standards out. So the statute for modular homes refers back to Chapter 10, which is the standards on which how they're supposed to be built. And those, again, preempt the ability or the need for a municipality to deal with MUBEC. And it really limits the authority of a municipality as to where they can involve and dictate placement. So most municipalities just don't care. They don't do that. And it's only more the, highly developed, more southern Maine communities or touristy areas that tend to regulate that. So the divided report, the concern was whether or not the language would preempt covenants on, neighborhoods. So if you had a private neighborhood and a cul-de-sac with design standards, are you going to be litigated if someone wants to put in a modular home that doesn't meet the covenant purposes? And that was the pushback on that. Of course, this section of law has nothing to do with that. And you can't do that because of the way in which it's constitutionally protected. But anyway, divided report and will preempt municipal control over that. There were a few others that were kind of focused on home shelters, and they rolled them up into one, trying to create more funding and a study group to understand emergency shelters and how to fund them, and the difference between like a wet shelter, which means that you can still be a user and get in, and trying to create funding mechanisms for that, because federal dollars do not allow you to accept folks in there under the influence of any substance. So a lot of the traditional shelters that we think of, are places that people who are active users of alcohol or a substance, they can't be admitted to. And those are federal guidelines. So how to create some wet shelters in order to get people that are in use into them and arguably safe. That's something that's a challenge, and everyone turned out for that. So that seems like there's going to be a study group that goes on, that's going to be ongoing, to look at how we can do the wraparounds, because if you have the shelter, what's also really important is actually providing them services. And those services just don't exist in most communities and need to be more robustly invested in. And, the same thing for, juveniles, how do you deal with juveniles in that setting who are active users and homeless?
And are they talking about those proposed shelters being municipally operated, or
in some cases they are? In some cases it is the nonprofits, but there's that need, because municipalities are federally funded as well, or receive like CDBG grants. They can't establish those wet shelters. So it has to be like a nonprofit, but they have a vested interest and are desperately trying to figure out how to deal with the encampments that are not safe for anybody. The entire area, in many cases, feeling really unsafe, and there's zero tools for them to be able to address it. So they're trying to increase that, and there will be a stakeholder group going forward. It's in a focus study on it. The other areas were about first responder health. There's a bill, LD 444, that was in insurance. It was introduced by Senator Bailey. It was kind of the second whack. Our previous bill, which was the funding bill that would just provide those programs for first responders statewide, regardless of their resources, is still sitting on appropriations table and is still the lowest barrier to getting everybody something. The funding mechanism isn't great. It's a one-time thing. It should be tied to marijuana revenue and be ongoing, because the threats to our public safety professionals are ongoing. And we've seen repeatedly very publicly how integrated these resources are and how much they work together to respond to emergencies, and then return to unequal resources at home, but have the exact same exposure to repeated trauma. So it's an unequal system. And LD 444 was looking at the health insurance aspect of that doesn't do the screenings or provide individuals access outside of what they deem as medically necessary based upon those parameters that are built on the civilian system. So there's a number of studies that indicate that not only is that failing our first responders, but they're not living as long as other individuals. And it's a huge problem. So if you're covered under your spouse's insurance, if you need like vitamin panels are one of those things, low vitamins as a result of working overtime, late nights, adrenaline, cortisol responses that you're consistently exposed to, they drain all of your resources. And to get a vitamin panel, you have to have some sort of gastrointestinal thing covered. You can't just go in and say, hey, what am I low on and have a plan, but there has to be some sort of piece to that. And those are like $500 tests. Cardiac screenings, same thing. It's like a $300 test that can detect it and get you some sort of assistance before a heart attack. That received a triple divided report with majority of Republicans saying that the towns need to pay more for this, even though the towns pay for both the workers' comp that pays after the heart attack happens and the health insurance that doesn't cover the screenings to catch it. The catch-22 just maybe didn't sink in. And then another group thought it should be workers' comp. And because there's such a misunderstanding about the role of workers' comp versus the role of health insurance and how disconnected they are, and that workers' comp is an injury, like the injury has to have happened. They can't prescribe preventative medicine or anything. They are an injury-only insurance. So we've got the expensive funeral and medical retirement covered. We're asking for the prevention. And of course, the insurance companies don't want to do that because they're afraid that they'll be overwhelmed, even though we have so few of these people in the state that are providing this service. And then, so the second divided report was that it would be referred to workers' comp because they thought it was a workers' comp issue because it's job related. And then the third was just ought to pass. Like there's a presumption that when you go to your doctor and say, hey, I'm a first responder, I'm not feeling that great. If he or she determines that you should have that test or you go in and request that test, the fact that you are a first responder, like if you live in a house in the 1970s, there's a presumption that you might be licking the walls and therefore need a lead test. We are asking for them to have a presumption that they need to have an earlier cardiac screening, beyond someone else, and they might need to speak to someone who's culturally competent so that we can get compassion fatigue before it becomes PTSD. All those things, nexus of. So it's about provider education as well. Yeah, we'll see what happens with that one. It's not dead.
But it's not dead, but it's not alive.
It's not dead, but it's got a couple of weird reincarnations. And, if anything, if insurance companies are that concerned about it, maybe they should be helping support the state level pool that would provide these at no cost, to those services, volunteer services that don't provide insurance. And these volunteers are already a challenge to hide or challenge to keep and find. And then the other thing is about Aurora Patrol. So there's been this perennial, at least in the past couple of years, conversation between some counties and Maine State Police, because Maine State Police has basically not received a staff increase since the 1970s. Yet the amount of time that they need to spend on issues, the specialization responses, and the types of crimes that folks are dealing with now take an incredible amount of time and have also grown exponentially. Sheriffs were looking for a way to backfill agreements that are kind of all over the spectrum in how they had assisted counties in certain areas. In some cases, there are actually more sheriff's deputies in a single county than there are state troopers to cover an entire section of Maine. So it's been this resource allocation conversation, and what it comes down to is something that we also understand at the municipal level is that after a while, you can't just get shit done. And we're like, oh, well, we didn't get anything. I guess we got to do it. So state police has been operating in that same way. Like, all right, we've got new mandates. Oh, we've got new, missions and new needs. We'll just get it done within existing resources. And now there's not enough resources to go around. And the in need is I think nearly tripled, especially for things like tactical team calls, where you have a barricaded subject that's a danger to themselves, but there's also a nexus with felony. There's like a whole risk assessment thing that happens. These are high risk entries that need a lot of specialized training and specialized gear that can't happen, but they're also increasingly necessary and can't wait for, you can't put that on hold and wait for resources to be there to stop those individuals from getting to that point. We need to have some sort of level of ability to respond. So the conversation really was about what level of staffing state police should have. So one bill that was introduced by Senator Timberlake the state can go no further below 2020. But in 2020, this stuff was happening at that point in time too. It's not a new thing. It's just been gradually increasing. And this year in particular has been absolutely horrible on that, or last year, I should say, on that scale, the calls for service that they have been needed at. And they've actually had to turn down high profile, high need, high risk incidents that when municipalities have called them existing police departments because they just got off, like 2 calls. They've had 4 hours in between 18 to 24-hour calls. They can't, pivot those resources to respond. So they are already struggling to meet the level of need and really can't have resources further shift to be dedicated into a single county for a call sharing agreement that would mean that someone had to physically be there.
So what happens in those situations? I mean, because usually when you're calling the police, it's because you have an emergency.
Yeah.
And if they can't respond, there's got to be somebody that would respond, right?
Well, state police is statutorily required to provide policing resources, and they do, to every single municipality, including those with an organized police department. If you have an organized police department, you're going to get that response much faster than if you're in a rural area. But you're going to be waiting for either a sheriff or a state trooper. Yeah.
So somebody would come.
Yes.
But
it's just about
hours.
Exactly. It's just about that length of time
Yep.
and that expectation. But what's been increasingly happening is the level of service need in those rural areas is very different. It's not just someone breaking into your camp.
Right.
Or, a neighborhood dispute, or that kind of thing. There are domestics, which is pretty much used to be the number one cause of homicides in Maine. That was the number one factor that's in there. And, and barricaded subjects and folks that are a significant threat to themselves and others. But you also have really, really complex crimes. So you're looking at the illicit weed grows that are happening. Those are things that require kind of a whole team of folks to be able to address and investigate. They take a long period of time to evaluate. Is it, legal or not? Is it a licensed entity? Those are growing. There's a lot of growth in rural areas because it is so far outside the law enforcement jurisdiction in terms of not everyone's hanging out in your hood.
Well, in some of the public hearings and work sessions, I remember hearing somebody say that OCP and municipalities don't share information, readily. So they don't have no way of knowing unless they say, is so-and-so at this address authorized?
Licensed, yeah. You might not even know. I mean, you can go into the record and figure out who it is, who you're sending the tax bill to, but you might not know who's necessarily at that residence.
Right.
So you might have the residence. And the medical program is the bigger part of that. Like, adult use already has, towns know exactly who is involved in the adult use. They have no ability to know who is in the medical, and they have to do that call out, and that's the way that statute was constructed, and it's a huge problem. So, yeah, part of the problem is local prosecutors won't do anything about it, and part of the problem is that there is a real big gap in the knowledge of, or trying to determine, is it illegal first, and then gathering enough evidence to justify a warrant, probable
Right.
cause for a warrant to go in and address it. So yeah, there's the growth of crime in rural areas. I think is a big one in Maine too. State police basically, in order to meet all their agreements, it's based in need, but they're very different. So it could be that they're supposed to cover a county every Thursday entirely, or it could be that they're covering certain sectors every other week. There's no consistency. Every single one of them is different, and their kind of zones are basically split into two different zones. So those troopers cover like northern zone and central zone and southern zone, a variety of different agreements, or in some cases no agreement at all. But the narrative has been that they are backing out and therefore not going to be available, but they'll always respond. They will always respond. So they're not doing policing. It's just that they're not going to put somebody specifically in that space to camp out there all day. And they're trying to like renegotiate those so that they're actually closer to the primary centers and like the interstate area, which they are also, statutorily required to patrol, and a lot of the other significant areas. But they provide a ton of resources for all municipalities, including like accident reconstruction for fatal accidents, computer crimes, and every single crime involves a computer now and requires multiple warrants. It's not just like pulling someone over, slapping them with a ticket, even if, for an OUI. It's really involved now. And those resources are going to be stretched at the other end, the courts and the Attorney General's office, to investigate the growth in homicides that we also had this year. So yeah, resources and lack thereof all the way around, I think, is pretty much the theme. Yeah, so
Definitely today's theme.
Yeah, general assistance, the lack of funds for that's an emergency need. Housing and substance use, that whole nexus, that is a need.
Franchise agreements.
Marijuana, like let's increase
Taxes.
the pressure on municipal government and then not fund it and think that the outcomes are going to improve and that the last resort and the last line should not be there. I don't know.
Excuse me, that municipalities are greedy, because in the end, we're just trying to do the same thing that the people at the state end are doing. They're trying to provide services to our residents, citizens of the state of Maine.
I don't know who says that we're greedy. Christ, if we were greedy, then we wouldn't be bootstrapping everything.
Well,
Right.
in the general assistance work session, it was the local option sales tax work session or public hearing. One of the I was the only proponent in the room, and one of the representatives from somewhere in the hospitality industry who were vehemently opposed actually intimated that municipalities do not need more money. They just need to manage their money more effectively.
Clearly someone who's never worked in a municipality.
Right.
So yeah,
Indeed.
you should contact a bunch of his municipalities and ask them if they would mind, I don't know, giving him a walkthrough, a day in the life of a municipal official in his own constituency. That might be good. All right, so I'm tired of feeling like suck. So let's try to end on a high note. No pun
With
intended.
cannabis. I'll give you a high note.
Yeah, so what are some of the funny things? Like, give me some joy.
The best thing that happened this week was at the on-site consumption public hearing, and one person got up and said that we need to determine whether you're medicated or whether you're intoxicated, because he uses cannabis for medical reasons, and he went out on his lunch break and smoked 2 bowls in his car just so he could sit in that room all day long. And he's medicated. He is not intoxicated. And it just made me laugh. And I was like, wow.
Maybe we've been approaching this wrong.
Right.
Important distinction.
Yes. Yes, I've often thought that would make things more tolerable. Some sort of level of anesthetization or something. Yeah.
Well, it's not coffee in that cup.
No, that just raises the anxiety and like the fidgetiness, and you're like, what are you talking about?
Right. It brings out those feelings. Of course, if I had alcohol, I probably wouldn't bite my tongue as much as I do. which would probably land me in hot water. So I'll stick with my routine now. What about you? What's something good that happened to you this week?
I'm gonna kick it to Lambo. Give me some joy.
You did Lambo.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Lambo's done.
I'm sorry. I was looking at you. I'm Cambo, what's bringing you joy?
So I would like to have my joy shout out go to the security folks at the State House, because they just smile and greet every person who comes through there just wholeheartedly, at least every time I've gone through, including the long line of folks who are bringing all of this apparatus and signs and in the Hall of Flags and share their story, which is commendable, and absolutely they should have the right to do so. But boy, they drag some crap through those screenings.
Yeah.
And so this week I was made official and got my actual Fast Pass badge to go through and avoid security. And when I walked out, I told the gentleman to have a great night and that I wasn't going to have to go through the gates anymore. And I said, but I don't really know how this works. And he goes, put your stuff down. Let us show you. And I'm like, okay. So they showed me how to do it and we woohooed. And yesterday when I showed up, I waved to them and waved my badge. And they said, go for it, girl. Come on through. And I really like them. And they just seem to have a really great attitude. And
yeah, it's nice when someone is happy to see you coming.
Right.
That's not always the case.
No, that's true.
Generally never the case.
Something good had to happen to you this week. What was it? Dig deep, girl.
Hello, darkness.
Black, like my cold, cold heart.
Exactly. Yes.
This is from the woman who posted a beautiful picture of a starry night. And I posted a comment that said, star night, star bright. And she goes, yeah, I was thinking highway to hell.
Yeah, I had a funny comment for that too, but I think I fell asleep before I posted it.
Oh my.
It was beautiful.
I'm honestly struggling to find joy. I actually have joy with my colleagues. So this is my joy space, is being around really amazing, intelligent women that bolster me on a regular basis and that tolerate a lot of my potty mouth and provide really great insight and work really, really hard. So like we've got our colleagues in legal and you guys, you bring me joy. So I get one little brief interlude sometimes with you.
Aww.
Before
That's sweet.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I know. I miss you guys.
Oh my.
Well, there we are.
There we are
then.
then.
Yes.
See you next week or next time we have a moment to breathe.
Yes. Hopefully soon.
Very soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.